I came to the conclusion that Australia needs China. Maybe I was wrong.
This is the Australian ship called the Topaz. In June of 2020, this ship left the port of Queensland in Australia with 90,000 tons of coal as its cargo. And its destination was the port of Jingtang, where it was set to unload its coal and then travel back to Australia over the course of several days. But that's not what happened, because once the Topaz reached the port of Jingtang, it was not allowed into the Chinese port. So the ship waited. 1 month passed, 2 months, 6 months, then 10 months. And eventually, the ship and all of its crew found itself being stranded at sea for nearly an entire year with no end in sight.
Let's take the story aside of the coal situation and the politics side of things. Imagine being the families of those men and women on that ship. Wow, that must be a real weird and very difficult time.
And as it turns out, this event would foreshadow one of the biggest economic issues that we are currently witnessing today.
Surely they're not.
But to explain why this event happened, why this event is also so important, and why it's creating a global economic crisis today, you must know that this crisis that we are currently experiencing may have actually started with a small bird just a few decades ago. A bird that caused one of the biggest crises of the 20th century. This is the Chinese sparrow.
Sorry, what? All this crisis started because of a bird? I don't even know what to say to that.
In the 1950s, the Chinese government didn't know much about these birds except for, well, one thing. And that thing was, well, they found out that these sparrows ate on average 4 pounds of Chinese grain per year. Now, on its surface, this may not seem like much, especially when you consider that all of the sparrows in China consume only a very small fraction of 1% of the grain in China. But at the time, the Chinese thought that this small fraction of a percentage was too much. You see, China in the 1950s was trying its best to adopt communist economic policies while becoming completely self-sufficient in regards to agriculture. So, in order to accomplish their goal, they banned privatization of all agricultural products within the country. They also decided that all of the food shall be collected and distributed by the government. They also changed their farming techniques to match that of the Soviet Union. They decreased crop diversity to help boost production quotas. And lastly, they stopped trading resources with all Western nations.
I'm pretty sure this sounds very similar to North Korea. This is the whole communist thing where that basically nothing's privatized. The government then gives out food and resources to people evenly. And obviously it never works out evenly because the top dictators basically, they take their fair share, if you know what I mean. Actually, this is one thing that annoys me politically in when nationalists, working class nationalists normally, always try and make out like socialist parties, like the Labour Party in the UK, are communists. And it's just thinking, what are you talking about? It's painful. There's a difference between communists and socialists. There's nothing wrong with people getting rich and earning what they make. Just a little rant.
In hopes of becoming completely self-sufficient. And all of those policy effects took place virtually overnight, which caused a massive shock to China's agricultural system. And soon, China would begin to experience a decrease in their food production, as well as a very serious national famine. However, there was one thing that would push this crisis over the edge, and that, of course, was the sparrow. You see, remember how the Chinese government didn't like that sparrows ate a small amount of their grain? Well, as it turns out, the Chinese government decided to order the extermination of all sparrows from the country in hopes of boosting food production.
I am fascinated to how this links to the Australian ship being stranded just outside China. This is a very long piece of string going on.
So, over the course of just a couple years, millions of sparrows in China were killed, and as a result, the sparrow became nearly extinct. And it would not take too long before China realized it had made one of the largest mistakes in the country's history. This one single policy change ended up making their famine substantially worse. You see, what China did not know was that sparrows were the main predators for all of the pests in their crop fields, meaning that as soon as the sparrows went away, the crop-eating pests, mainly locusts, began swarming the entire country. And
sometimes you have to give a little bit to stop a lot more being taken. The sparrows will eat a little bit, but by them eating a little bit, they also eat all the insects that will absolutely ravage on your crops. Basic stuff, surely. Even I know that, and I'm not even a farmer.
And these locusts were not eating just a small fraction of 1% of the food like the sparrows were. These swarms of locusts literally destroyed entire farms or even villages of crops at a time. So it was this event that ended up making the famine in China turn into the Great Chinese Famine, a crisis that caused tens of millions of people to starve to death over a 5-year span. And remember, all it took was a few policy changes and one hasty economic decision to cause a crisis on a massive scale. And well, that brings us to today.
How does it link with
Remember
Australia?
that ship, the Topaz, that we last saw being stranded at sea in China? Well, as it turns out, this was also because of a hasty economic decision that came from the Chinese government. You see, in June of 2020, just a few months into the pandemic, the Australian Prime Minister Scott Morrison called for an investigation into the origin of the pandemic in China. Now, on its surface, this may not have seemed like much of a story at the time, but in reality, this would be the instigator for the global crisis that we are seeing today.
On the whole investigation on where did the virus come from, we've had plenty of that sort of conversation over here. Or was it made in a lab, for example? Are China trying to take over the world and all those sort of things?
This is because China did not take this criticism of the Australian Prime Minister very well. In fact, because of a handful of seemingly minor sentences from the Australian Prime Minister, China decided to start a trade war with Australia. And again, on its surface, there should have been a clear winner of this trade war, as China's economy is roughly 10 times larger than that of Australia's. But what China did not realize was how reliant it was on Australia. You see, China ended up banning or placing high tariffs on things like barley, beef, and about a dozen other Australian products. And as it turns out, one of these banned items was coal. And so, well, that is why in June of 2020, as the Topaz and 60 other bulk carriers were on their way to China, they all of a sudden were not allowed into Chinese ports with their coal. Because, well, China overnight banned and canceled all of their trade deals in relation to coal. Now, to most Western nations, coal isn't that important to their respective economies and infrastructure.
So this seems very much a case of China chopping off their nose to spite their face. And I assume it is so important to China because of the infrastructure, the building that goes on in China. Bearing in mind, just look at anything that is made. Where does it come from? China. I think their manufacturing requires so much coal to basically power everything. I may be slightly wrong. There may be some other factors there, but they are so reliant on coal. If you look at the UK, now don't get me wrong, the UK still has plenty of bad things, offshore oil and things, but I don't think we have any coal mines or any coal factories anymore. Pretty sure we don't have any energy provided by coal. I may be slightly wrong, but I'm not far off the truth if I am.
For example, countries like Canada, France, the UK, and the Nordic countries produce less than 10% of their electricity from coal. And even on the upper end of the Western nations like the United States and Germany, they only produce about 15 to 20% of their electricity from coal. But then we have China. And well, China produces over 65% of its electricity from coal.
This comes back to the whole climate change and the COP26 and things. China, who couldn't even be bothered to turn up to the COP26, they are so reliant on coal. And I understand when, and China is huge. So I understand when people say, well, what's the point of us changing when they're not going to? They cause a lot more problems, them and Russia, for example. And it's painful statistics, isn't it? It's really painful statistics to hear.
Meaning that the less coal China has available to them, the less likely it'll be able to produce electricity for its country.
But then
now,
they can't
China
make
is
things for
actually the
everyone else.
world's largest producer of coal, and roughly 75 to 90% of all coal used in China is produced domestically. However, for coal that is used for industrial processes, like the making of metals, and for a large fraction of its coal power plants, China is reliant upon coal imports from other countries in order to fulfill its needs. And well, who do you think was at the top of that list for coal imports to China in 2020? It was, of course, Australia. Before the coal ban, China was importing roughly 78 million metric tons of coal from Australia per year, and to put that in perspective, the next closest nation was Indonesia, where they were importing roughly 48 million tons of coal. And so, slowly, from June of 2020 up until today, China's coal reserves kept depleting, in part due to stopping the imports from Australia. Now, it's also worth noting that during this time, there was some major flooding in southern and eastern Asia that caused many Chinese and Indonesian coal mines to close down. There were also a handful of other policies, such as increasing the safety guidelines for coal companies in China, that also decreased coal production. And so, because of one hasty policy decision against Australia and a few other environmental and policy events, we started to see just a few months ago that Chinese cities began going dark. Power outages began affecting factories and homes, supply chains began getting severely disrupted again, and Chinese banks that had loans with these coal companies began seeing the signs of defaults on these loans.
Is this why my AliExpress order hasn't arrived yet? The factories have shut down.
And as this began happening, China began implementing new policies such as ramping up coal production in their working mines and also importing more coal from other nations that weren't Australia. They also began mandating cutting electricity consumption from factories and residences, and also made their banks start making extremely risky loans to new upstart coal companies in China. But at the end of the day, none of those short-term solutions worked, and China was forced to do something that it did not want to do. Remember those 60 or so Australian bulk carriers that were stranded in China?
Right. Straight away, the one thing, it's almost like the one thing China needs to do is apologize. This is like two children in a school in the school playground. And the teacher's there, just apologise. No, I'm not apologising. He needs to apologise first. That seems to be exactly what it is. And China, let's be honest, they're definitely stubborn. I don't know about Australia, but you can tell China is very stubborn.
Well, as it turns out, China became so desperate for coal that just a few weeks ago, they allowed some of those stranded ships to unload their coal into Chinese ports. Now, it's also worth mentioning that some Australian ships are still stranded after being at sea for well over a year. Wow. And many of these ships also got rerouted to different countries like India and South Korea, who ended up actually buying a lot of this stranded Australian coal. But the effects of this Chinese energy crisis, and what it should be called, which is the Chinese coal shortage, are being felt worldwide right now. Many large companies that are reliant on Chinese manufacturing are seeing similar or even longer delays than what they were seeing at the beginning of the pandemic in 2020. In fact, there have been a handful of large corporations that have begun switching their manufacturing out of China and into other countries or even domestically, largely because companies are realizing that manufacturing in China is becoming more unreliable. And because of decisions like this and the shutdown of some factories and the electricity shortages, China's manufacturing industry shrank for the second time in modern history this year.
There's no talk here about changing energy supply, going from coal to wind, solar. There's no talk of that. So clearly China are focused on one thing.
And so, where is this all going? Well, this coal crisis is already taking a chunk out of China's economy and will likely do so for the foreseeable future. And despite this ongoing energy crisis, China still refuses to lift the ban on Australian coal simply because of a few sentences said over a year ago. And a few recent quotes from a Chinese energy specialist and a Chinese coal data company stated that the biggest provinces now only have 9 to 14 days worth of coal reserves left. And with winter coming soon in China, the country will have to make a tough decision. Will it potentially allow power outages in winter and a continual shutdown of its core economy simply because of those few sentences said by the Australian Prime Minister? Or will it lift the bans on Australian coal, admitting that the government made a hasty decision that ended up creating an energy crisis that the country didn't expect? What do you think will happen?
I actually think the title of this video is wrong. How Australia is crashing the world economy and taking down China. That's not correct, because Australia isn't really doing anything. It should be something like how China is taking down China and the rest of the world. Just because Sol ScoMo said something not very well thought out, that doesn't mean they're taking down the world. It's China's stubbornness, basically, isn't it? It's nationalism. And it disappoints me as well when they say about China needing to make decisions. But the problem is, it's not China that needs to make decisions. It's old Zhu Wei, whatever his name is, whoever's in charge. It's the head honcho. The dictatorship at the top that, needs to make the decision. Don't lump all Chinese people together.
And all this means is that China has a few weaknesses. And those weaknesses are its energy consumption and its irrational and hasty economic policies. And as it turns out, Australia, the seemingly innocuous Western nation, ended up accidentally revealing the weaknesses of China to the world. It also revealed that Australia is one of the very few nations that can influence China's economy directly to the point of a national crisis.
As I just said, though, yes, if Australia didn't want to give them coal, then yes, they are directly impacting them, intentionally. But this isn't intentional from Australia. This is Chinese problem that doesn't want to accept the goods.
And who knows, maybe as Australia and other Western nations continue to get closer, we may begin to see a further divide between China and the Western world. Now I just want to make one more quick note, and that is a video game that I am developing now.
We don't need to know about that. Sorry, mate. As I said, this is very much more a case of China's chopping off their nose to spite their face. This is their problem. This isn't Australia's problem. But does it not highlight the fact that China relies so much on coal when the world is changing and the world needs to be fixed? Basically. An interesting video, and it's interesting how it's gone from the sparrow eating wheat to China making rash, almost uneducated changes that then actually costs them dearly. An interesting one. Anyway, thank you so much for watching. Make sure you like and subscribe, and I will catch you next time.